thank you to Jenny and to Trish and to the Interfaith Forum for inviting me to come over today. I was trying to remember the first time I ran one of these workshops in this type of collaboration. We've also worked on cross-border projects on intercultural dialogue as well. And I couldn't remember, but I've been working with Jenny since about 2007, broadly on the nature of intercultural dialogue and using objects for discussion. And Michael's presentation resonated brilliantly with some of the things that we're going to work through in my very short workshop and presentation this morning. And in the work that I've done with Jenny and with Trish over the last few years. So today's session is really going to be about unpicking this idea from a pedagogical perspective of object-based learning, so what we understand and we mean object-based learning to be, and how we, and to an extent sort of how that differs from the idea and the concept of an artefact. And also how we can use this for intercultural and interfaith discussion. So in the work that I've done in this area over the years with the Chester Beatty, but also the first major exhibition I worked on was the Sacred Texts exhibition at the British Library, which was 2007, I think, and was just an apprehension both of museum educators, but more broadly teachers, to use museum artefacts and objects for interfaith and intercultural dialogue. A fear about not knowing, not being the expert, and not understanding enough about a particular faith or a particular religion or particular practices to feel confident enough about working with objects. We're going to work with objects from a few different faiths this morning in the workshop together. And the purpose really is to show that actually when we work with objects, we bring our own experiences and knowledge. We are coming from our own perspective, but when even, as Michael was saying, you know, start them young. Even when you're working with really young children in the classroom, you can still generate these wonderful and rich ideas and allow them to become the experts to then scaffold and develop a conversation. So we're just going to start with a little bit of background on a sort of an understanding of object-based learning. So the main areas that we're going to cover is this context and background of what we understand and mean object-based learning today to be. So that's the sort of teacher aspect of what we're going to do, and then moving into the sacred, working with objects and developing these inquiry routines and how to facilitate working with objects. So object-based learning for me and for those of us who work predominantly within a museum or art-based setting is really about a form of education and facilitation. And object-based learning has been around for years. It's nothing new. It's writing about it, particularly within a museum context, started to flourish about sort of 20 years ago. There was a lot of work done in the UK amongst museum educators, but also amongst education specialists, for example, at the University of Roehampton, who wrote about it. But it's something that has now, I think, in terms of museum education, museum educators work with objects, but don't really think about how and the why they work with objects. And many museums have lots of objects of faith in their collections from societies, both past and present. And of course, we're in one of those institutions today. So at its root, object-based learning is an approach that facilitates deep learning. And the reason is because it is participant-centered, participant-focused. It's about the audience you're working with, in this case we're thinking about school-age children, drawing on their own ideas and experiences, and the value that we place in those ideas of experiences as well. And also, going deeper, challenging those concepts further on about the other, or challenging our own preconceptions. So it's about this fact that through drawing connections and through using objects, we mediate and strengthen our learning. Now there's two sort of schools, I suppose, around object-based learning. One is that object-based learning is about touch and sense. So we will, with gloves, do some touching and handling today. But actually, equally, as you will see when you go around the galleries, those of you going on the tour, we can work with objects in much the same way, even if they are digital. So we will do some digital engagement with objects as well, and show that object-based learning can be digital as well as very much focused on physical touch. And we can use objects in cases. And we do here in the Chester Beatty as much as I do in other settings like the British Library or the British Museum, because of course we can't always touch all the objects that we work with for lots of different reasons, primarily to do with the value of the objects or the conservation element of the objects. So the general sort of summary, and I came across quite recently, but sort of the last couple of years, a fantastic resource from Flinders University in Australia. In the UK, UCL has been very much at the forefront of research around object-based learning, primarily in relation to this element of touch and sense, and also in relation to well-being. Less so about the conversations and the dialogue and the dialogical approach to object-based learning, which is really the area that I'm most interested in. But I do like this resource and this checklist from Flinders University because it just reminds us of those benefits of using objects in the classroom. And I think particularly as we move up through school ages, I think some of these as well, this challenging sort of troublesome knowledge or difficult conversations, using objects as a stimulus is a really useful way of doing that. And I think particularly as well those elements of complexity and ambiguity, and trying to understand different points of view. Effectively, objects are there as a mediation tool, as a tool for stimulus. So we are going to work now. I'm just going to come out of here, and hopefully we can skip over to a digital object that we're going to work with today. So this is an object I work with both physically, not touching sadly, but also digitally. And we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around this object now. As an introduction, I want you to write down or think of in your head, if you haven't got paper, as many questions about this object. So if this object could speak, what questions would you ask it? So what questions would you ask this object if it could speak? So you might say, where is it from? What is it? So we'll open the object in a minute, but we're just going to look at this object as an object. You can do this actually with any object. I often bring a little object, a little pot actually, out with me, but it's a good warm-up activity just to get us thinking about the different ways in which we can interrogate an object. I call this kind of like the anatomy of an object, drawing out those different questions. On a good day, we might get 10 questions. On a very, very good day, about 20 is very good. So let's see how many questions we can generate. Lovely. So if we can all come back together. So what kind of questions does anybody want to kick us off? Trish, go on. You can start us off. Give us a question. How old are you? Lovely. So we're already starting to think about some elements of the age or the provenance. Any other questions that you thought of? Language, yeah. So what language? Yeah, or languages, lovely. So that's a really nice, yeah. So what languages are used or is it written in? Yeah. Somebody said about design? Yeah, who designed it? You might have had something around like who made it.
It's,
yeah.
There are the particular shapes, like you can see some face, like on the top if you go down. So
Yeah.
Symbolize like the two tusks they are downwards.
Oh yes. So looking a bit more about the particular delicacies or nuances of the design. So where's that tradition? Yeah. So what symbols have we already thought about symbols? So what symbols might we see in here? Anything else? Yes, Michael.
Back simply to the front cover.
Yeah.
The first question I would ask is, how did you survive so long? Simply because it's so decorative, it's got jewels, and it's just something of beauty and something easily stealable and slippable. So how did you survive so long? So what's the story of your own history?
Yes. Yeah, fantastic. So so it's actually thinking about the story and the journey. The object itself has gone on through time. I'm always really intrigued about where the jewels have come from. That's always something that I always think about. Yeah, so lots and lots of different questions that we've generated, and at this point actually not really any that have specifically addressed the religious or sacred nature of this object, which is fine, because actually if we start from a comfort point of things that we can see and things that perhaps we can appreciate, that then can springboard us into some of those other questions about the symbolism, the meaning, particularly to particular faiths or societies or cultures or peoples. Perhaps also when we talk about languages as well. So I use that as a sort of that 20 questions activity, as a warm-up activity to help us think about different ways we might approach objects. And that takes us from the familiar into the familiar. So so this is quite small. So if you can see it, so at the top, in this wheel or this anatomy of an object, we sort of look at things like creation. So what is it? Who produced it? When and where? Motivation. Why was it made? And I think that when we start to talk more deeply about sacred objects and sacred texts, I think this is quite an important area, because we start to think about why it was important to the people who made it, particularly as well if we think about why and how it survived. And that connects us as well into the area of value and significance for me as well. And particularly, again, when we think about sacred objects, the value isn't always in its monetary value. It's in the value to the faith it is part of, but also sometimes what it represents as part of its story. One activity I used to do at the British Library was comparing 3 Bibles in translation, in English translation, and one of them was Tyndale's Bible. One of them was the King James Bible, and thinking about what those meant to those people at the time, particularly when we think about the Tyndall translation and that he lost his life to translate the Bible into English. So value is a really interesting area that we can start to unpick. Again, significance, but actually also techniques and materials. When we go up into the collections here in particular, you know, we're starting to look and explore objects that have taken time, devotion, faith to create and to produce, and understanding that the making of the book is also bound up in the faith of the people that made it, as well as elements of the design and the aesthetic as well. Why was it, you know, you brought up that question of that sort of element of design, and you were talking about the design that we have predominantly in the text that we looked at there, predominantly Celtic design. So how is that used to communicate meaning? We can also bring in things like the symbolism as well, and thinking as well about the connections and provenance. And we talked about the stories in the histories, the subjects and themes, reflection and inspiration. So these are all ways in which we can approach objects. And I use this wheel in my own teaching and my own practice. I don't necessarily, it's not something I would necessarily do overtly with a group of students, with school children, but these are questions and things that I have in my mind when I'm planning, when I'm designing activities, and when I'm working. So I might just focus on one area. It might be more about the aesthetic and the techniques and materials, which will lead us onto the value and significance, because we're thinking about what you know, why they were made. Or it might be something that is purely about more about the content, so the subject and theme. So, you know, we might not use all of those in one workshop. So when we're designing activities with students for around object-based learning, the idea, and this is this is going to be evidenced in the next activity that we do, is about these activities are designed to be socially mediated. Because of COVID, I got you to just do those questions on your own. It's obviously much more fun if we can do much more group work and discuss and think about ideas together. But that social mediation is really important. The dialogic, so speaking aloud, using discussion before even we think about writing down ideas or even creating or making in response. So our high-level Socratic questioning. And these areas which we're going to explore now is this idea of collective thinking, which we've started to do in that initial group discussion. Collaborative interaction, so we're building on each other's ideas, and of course critical thinking, that questioning why as well, and bringing it back to that. So using the same principles that we use to dissect that sacred text, I want you to have a look at the object that you've got. So first of all, just look. So what is it? So what can you see? What is it made of? What is it made from? Are there any images? Are there any symbols? Lovely, fantastic. Some really lovely discussions happening there, and I hate to break into that. And but what was really nice is that there was, you know, as I was sort of going around and listening to some of those conversations, and also as you were feeding back to me, it's like, oh, well, I don't know the language. But it's the point about this, and language, of course, particularly when we talk about sacred texts, can be and is incredibly important. But equally, not being able to read or I necessarily immediately identify the language is also fine. And part of using objects in this way is to kind of break down those barriers and tensions and apprehensions about not understanding or being able to read another language. But it's about unpicking the significance that those languages or the word or the text might perform in relation to the object or the text. So did you notice what was in the middle?
Yes, it's like a psalm book.
It's like a book of Psalms. Yeah. So actually, in the middle of if I could ask this table, because you also had a Hamza as well as a keyring. So what's quite interesting, and I like the notice you notice the significance of the jewel, the stones and the crystal and perhaps the material. So yes, it is but in the middle of this one is a book of Psalms. Tiny, tiny, tiny book of Psalms, and you often find these as part of keyrings. These, less traditionally today, are carried around by followers of the Jewish faith because they need to carry their psalms around with them when they are saying their prayers. However, if you notice, could you get into the book of Psalms?
I didn't try.
No, so this is locked down, so you can't get into it. And even if you could get into it, and in other versions that I've seen, the text is so tiny that it would be, you need not even a magnifying glass to read it. So why produce a sacred text that is locked away, or the text is so small that you actually can't physically read it, but you know you have to carry it around with you?
I suppose it's a little bit like the Lord's Prayer written on the head of a pin. You know, it's just something to carry around to remind you of the prayers that you need to say.
Yeah, and it's also the fact that you have to have the text with you when you're saying the prayer. So even though you will know it by rote or know it by memory, it's having the actual physical text with you as well. So that was probably in some ways a little bit more easy to identify as a religious or sacred object. But actually, again, what I want to show with using some of these objects is that most of these objects are not very expensive objects. These are objects that actually can be found in many different sort of either high street shops that are related to faith or Amazon, should I dare say it. But it shows you that actually there are objects that you can easily acquire for these kinds of discussion and these kinds of facilitation that don't cost a fortune and are not that difficult to source, but actually are quite thought-provoking as well. I'll just cover that one. Anybody else want to talk about their object? Yes, yeah. You were having a very interesting debate. I really like the fact that you picked out, particularly about it, the nature of it being on a T-shirt. So again, one thing about using objects in the classroom, Jenny's given me some time, is that actually often, again, we want to challenge that we can find and see. I mean, we were talking about symbols, sacred symbols and sacred objects anywhere, and actually how does it change the nature of the object if it's on a T-shirt rather than if it's on something you might carry or an object? Does anybody recognise this? Yeah. Yeah. So this is the Om. So generally used in meditation and in Hinduism, the symbol and the sound of the universe. So it's really interesting to think about it being on a T-shirt. So Jenny's just given me 3 minutes. So let's just quickly jump to the flags? It's interesting you pick up that they're not actually that well made, generally because I think they are designed to be hung outside, and also high up as well. So Nepal as we know, is a mountainous country, and the prayers being offered and sort of blown on the breeze as well. But again, making inferences and interpretations about the different languages as well, and trying to draw on different ideas that we might have. Again, we might not have our own particular knowledge of the language, but yeah, you were making some deduction around the being Nepalese, and maybe Hinduism or Buddhism. Often we're not always sure about the nature of the different religions, but you know, you're picking up some really interesting ideas about the horse and the manufacture and nature of the object. And then we've got two very similar objects, which we picked primarily for the symbolism. You might notice that we have the little cakes here. These are for Chinese New Year. But again, did anybody think about the colour? Yeah, so you might have been thinking about some of the relevance of the colour. You were very interested in the language and where words and different languages were repeated. So you might have been looking at some of those types of things as well. One of the things that we were doing there, and we could have gone into more depth about had we had more time for the discussion, but we were starting to use our collective ideas, our collective thoughts. We were interacting with each other either in our pairs and as a group to build on each other's ideas. We were thinking about that idea, that concept of inquiry dialogue, so questioning our own preconceptions as well as perhaps our partners, and of course, you know, we could do this in bigger groups, and also as the group as a whole. And then you know, starting off actually, the starting point really with those acts of wondering, what is it? What is it used for? How is this a sacred object, or how does it relate to a particular faith or tradition? So that brings us into this sort of stage element of building and drawing together our critical thinking skills. So going through this so think of this in a slight hierarchy of knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So understanding the nature of the objects and text that we're working with. Had we had time, but this is your homework, I would have got you to take one object. Again, I did choose a Christian object, and it was only because we are almost in the run-up to Advent, and think about the different ways in which you might approach the interpretation of this object. Michael spoke very at the beginning about interpreting objects. So it might be thinking about how you would look at the design or the material or the objects, and also bringing in perhaps some of those sensory elements such as smell. We've got some feathers and things like that. So actually you can so often, it's not just about the object itself, but how you might associate other objects to bring that object to life to help with the interpretation of the object. I'm always a great fan of bringing in a bit of music to understanding and interpreting sacred objects, because and Trish was talking earlier on about food, always a really good one. So there are some. So there's the summary, and there are some links here as well. Jenny and I have created some resources for an EU project we're both working on called the Creative School. So there's a more in-depth sort of self-directed CPD session on just using objects in general, not so much sacred objects, on the open educational resources. And there's also a link to Chester Beatty's resource on fantasy and imagination, I believe. And as Jenny mentioned at the beginning, we're looking for people to help pilot and prototype online sessions with the Chester Beatty. So thank you very much. Thank you. Went very quickly. So thank you. I'll put my mask back on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. And I think Jo has done this workshop a number of times with us. We also did this workshop with Ailish and Keith, and not Kieran because you weren't here in March 2020, but we tried it with the JCT religious education team. But if you are interested in helping us pilot these, because COVID has just disrupted our flow. We would be very interested in working particularly with schools, because we're trying to aim this at schools, but if there are community groups as well, why not open it up to community groups? So Justina and Heidi are here, or myself. Please approach us. We'd love, and Jo will be here facilitating online with us as well. So it's you're in good hands. So thank you very much, and thank you for participating in this workshop today.